Today's lesson will be on understanding the point of view of the character. Today and tomorrow we'll be reading an article about how a family dealt with Hurricane Katrina. As we read, we will look at the narrator and the other characters to see how they react to the events of Hurricane Katrina. But first, let's look at some background information about Hurricane Katrina. Hurricane Katrina was one of the most strongest and most expensive and most damaging hurricanes to hit the United States. A hurricane is a storm with very strong winds that starts in the ocean. In August of 2005, Hurricane Katrina moved from the Atlantic Ocean onto the coast of Florida, Louisiana, Alabama, and Mississippi. By the time it finished, 1,833 people died. Damages to homes and property cost $108 billion, and more than 1 million people had to leave their homes. Now let's stop and take a look at the map just for a moment. As you can see, this is a map of New Orleans, where most of Hurricane Katrina hit the hardest. Now, as we look at the diagram here, you'll notice that the key shows us the areas that are below sea level and above sea level. Now, the very light pink, almost white, is what is above sea level. Now, as you can see, this is the Mississippi River, and then there's a lake here, a very large lake. Now, the areas that are above sea level means that the land and the shoreline is above where the ocean water would be. Anything below the sea level indicates that that is the land and the shoreline that is actually below the sea level and the sea water. So you can see how most of this area around New Orleans is below sea level. So therefore, they had to build these levees, which are here on the right, which I'll read about in a moment. And these are just tall walls that were built to stop the seawater from coming to shore. So as I keep reading, you'll see it says most of the damage happened in the city of New Orleans, Louisiana, which is bordered by two lakes, a river, and a gulf, the Gulf of Mexico. The levees, right over here, or the walls that usually held back the water, broke in many places, flooding 80% of the city. In some places, the water was up to 20 feet deep, as high as the roof of houses. So as you can imagine, when the hurricane hit with all this heavy rain, it was very devastating and caused a lot of damage, as we indicated. Now, this hurricane started in Florida at a Category 5, and by the time it hit New Orleans, it was between a Category 3 and ended up as a Category 1. So, from our understanding of hurricanes, you can imagine this was very dangerous. Now let's read our story, Save Bella. As we read, let's think about the narrator, the other characters, and how their point of view affects how they handle the storm and react to it. As I read, I'm going to be thinking about these questions. Who is the narrator? Who are the other characters? How does the narrator describe Hurricane Katrina? How does the narrator and the other characters react differently to the events of Hurricane Katrina? As I am reading, I will highlight information in the text that helps me to answer those questions on the side. You too will be answering these questions on your own in your assignment when you are done with the video. As I'm reading, I notice that Darren is the narrator of the story. He is telling the story in first person. So let me just write that in there so I remember. Darren, and we're telling it in first person, which means the story is being told by him in the first person. It's his account. As I continue to read, I know that the other people in the story are Mama, Daddy, and Sherry, and Granny as well, and also their dog, Bella. And there's Granny right there. So if I want to write that on the side so I don't forget, it would be Daddy, Mama, Sherry, who is his twin sister, Granny, oops, it makes that capital, Granny, and the dog, Bella. All right, now I'll continue reading on. Maybe we should go to the Superdome, Mama offered, rehashing an argument from earlier in the day. We can't take Bella. Sherry sounded exasperated as she paged through a worn copy of People magazine. Plenty of folks are headed for the stadium, Daddy said, stepping off the ladder. I've seen this kind of thing before. Rations will be scarce, and without enough food and water, it's going to get ugly. We're better off staying right where we are. You'll see. I'd like to believe that Daddy was right, but at the moment I had some serious doubts. Granny must have noticed the alarmed look on my face. Don't you worry, she smiled, patting my head as I sat down at the kitchen table. The levees will keep us safe. She sipped from her cup of peppermint tea and dealt herself another hand of solitaire. I wasn't very reassured, because Granny always claimed that someone else would protect us. If it wasn't God, the saints, or the angels, it was the president, the governor, or the army. Once she claimed that Grandpa's ghost was watching over us, which I thought was kind of creepy. The problem was that I didn't have much faith in the city's levee system. Much of New Orleans was below sea level. It was like a giant bowl just waiting to be filled. The levee walls kept the water at bay, but I had heard a powerful storm surge could overtop them. It was only a matter of time before the city experienced some major flooding. Earlier, when I voiced my concerns to Sherry, she just shrugged and said, Grandma says the army built the levees, so we'll be fine. I rolled my eyes in her response. So to begin, I'm going to look at the questions about the characters and their reactions. I notice in here that it says, the narrator said, that Sherry is a lot like Dad, who is very impulsive and stubborn. Mama is like Darren, the narrator, very cautious and reasonable. Now, I noticed that their reactions to the hurricane are very different based on their personalities. I know that down here because it says that Sherry thought that they were going to be just fine because Grandma said that the army built the levees and it would be fine. Darren, on the other hand, was more cautious and reasonable. He had his doubts. He questioned the levee system. It states that Darren said, I wasn't very reassured because Grandma was always counting on everyone else, whereas he knew the facts and he knew that the levee system could not handle much more. Also, it says up here that Dad was very stubborn. Dad said that he was concerned about the rations and that he believed that they would be just fine where they were, that there was no reason for them to move on. Darren describes the storm by saying Hurricane Katrina was barreling towards New Orleans. So we know that the storm was raging. It was starting to get pretty intense. He also talks about it being a very powerful storm surge, and his concerns were that it could overpower the levees. As I read the next section, I will be looking at how the narrator describes Hurricane Katrina again, and how does the narrator and the other characters react differently to the events of Hurricane Katrina. We're continuing to look at their point of view and how the story is told. If meteorologists were right, Hurricane Katrina would be the worst storm in the city's almost 300-year history. Plenty of people decided to stay in town for one reason or another. Many were going to the Superdome, the convention center, or other makeshift shelters, places where pets were prohibited. Even over the whistling wind, I could hear the distant chorus of neighboring dogs abandoned by their fleeing owners. Bella joined in to howl along with them. Bella, shush, Granny said. The old beagle yawned nervously. Daddy often claimed that Bella had raised Sherry and me. He would joke that her nurturing made us into a couple of wild animals, which wasn't fair at all. The only reason I ever got into trouble was from trying to keep Sherry out of trouble. Bella was hardly wild, though. She spent most of her time lounging under the kitchen table. silently begging for table scraps, or simply overseeing the house like a queen, surveying her domain. You'll you'll keep us safe, won't you, old girl? Granny reached under the table and scratched Bella's head. You need to go outside? She asked. As we can see, the narrator, Darren, has his own understanding of what he thinks the storm is going to be like. He says here that he thinks it's going to be one of the worst storms in the city's history, and he's basing that on what the meteorologists have told him. Whereas Grandma in the previous part of the story had said, "Oh, it's just just another one of those storms." We can see throughout the text so far that the characters are reacting differently to the events of Hurricane Katrina based on their prior experiences and based on their own personalities. We will read the rest of the story tomorrow and find out what happens to this family during Hurricane Katrina. Right now, I'd like you to stop the video and go to your assignment in OneNote and answer the questions that go along with this part of the story. Feel free to go back to the video to look at some of the information and the evidence that I've highlighted throughout the video to support your answers.